Those two matters, slavery and the treatment of women, terrific to actually examine the historical record. And the historical record is there. It's written about by Christians and by pagans. So, there was an episode of The West Wing where Jeb Bartlett says, there's not one condemnation of slavery in the Bible. And, so he's saying how bad Christians were. And if only there had been, Abraham Lincoln would have been in a better position. That's spectacularly ignorant. It's spectacularly ignorant. So in Paul's letter to Philemon, he's talking about the slave that is going back to Philemon. And he says, now you must embrace our brother Onesimus, I think his name is, as your brother. He is no longer to be treated as a slave. He is your brother. And Paul also says that when I get out of prison, I'm going to come and stay with you for a while, meaning I'm going to see how. So the early Christians had no power to change politics, and slavery was universal in the ancient world, as it has been universal in most pre-modern societies. There were slaves, there were Maori slaves, there were Aztec slaves, there were Mayan slaves, there were slaves all through Africa. And the first thing Christians did was try to get better treatment for slaves. Indeed, you can see that all through the Old Testament, trying to get better treatment for them. Then imposing some morality on slave owners. That was the first principle of bodily protection for slaves that anyone had ever done. Very early on, Christians were raising money to free slaves. And then Paul lists a series of things which are so wicked that you must never do them. And one of them is slave trader. He says, there are these wicked people in the world. And one of the things he lists is slave traders. Now, sadly, later on, a lot of Christians did own slaves and so on. It took the Christians a long time to work it out. But this sense of equality for slaves was very strong. Very early on, bishops, ex-slaves became bishops. The Christian monastic movement under Benedict in the 6th century, one of the reasons it insisted on everyone having a habit was that wearing the same clothes was that neither a former nobleman nor a former slave would be distinguishable by their clothes. The Bishop of Rome certainly in the 3rd century was a slave, and there's some evidence that in the 2nd century the Bishop of Rome had been a slave. So actually the Christian record on slavery, especially of early Christians, is fantastic. And Paul's statement quite clearly, there is neither slave nor free. Jesus wiping people's feet, the actions of a slave, suffering crucifixion, the death of a slave, and all the rhetoric about slaves, you must make yourself into the lowest and so on. And then the other question, very briefly, of women, of course, there's overwhelming archaeological evidence that there were many more women than men in the early Christian movement. And the conception of women that Christians offered was completely revolutionary. So marriage was a bond of mutual love. Paul said that the husband must love his wife as much as Christ loved the church. Now we know that Christ went to his death on the cross for the church. So that's the demand of a husband. If necessary, he must go to death for the love of his wife. The father's authority, Christianity is pro-family, but it was not pro the ancient family with this absolute authority and so on. So the father's authority and the husband's authority are also subject to Christ's authority. So they are no longer absolute. So there's a sort of a liberation amongst women. And of course, as soon as there were people devoted to religious life, monks and so on, there were far more women than there were men. In fact, I title a chapter Corinth and the Sexual Revolution, because the Christians brought about a sexual revolution of equality and restraint and so on. It was the best conception of women that humanity had ever had, and of course that's why today we have equal rights and all the rest of it.